I'm Renee Lockhart, 47, and I command the regiment that plays the enemy in the Army's largest war games, out in 1,000 square miles of Mojave Desert. I spent my whole career being the person nobody saw coming, a machinist's daughter who sent money home for years to a father who told everyone I played computer games for the Army. But when a decorated colonel laughed me out of his planning briefing in front of his entire staff, not knowing I commanded the Red Force about to hunt him for 14 days, I didn't say a word. I just let the desert make the introduction. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who decided they knew everything about you at a glance? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. It was 1987, and I was 8 years old the first time my father told me what real work was. We were standing in his machine shop in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, and he held up a steel coupling he had just turned on the lathe, still warm, and he said, "Real work leaves metal shavings on the floor, Renee. Everything else is talk." He wasn't being cruel. He was being Earl Lockhart, and Earl Lockhart believed that the world divided cleanly into people who made things you could hold and people who made excuses. My mother, Nadine, ran the cafeteria at the elementary school and kept the shop's books at night, and she was the one who slipped me library books about tanks and bridges and the maps of old battles, always quietly the way you pass contraband. I loved that shop. I want to say that clearly because this is not a story about hating where I came from. I loved the smell of cutting oil and the sound of the mill and the way my father's hands knew things his mouth never said. What I learned early was that his respect ran along one narrow track, and I was not on it. When I was 13, the VFW hall in town held a chess night, and I beat 4 grown men in a row, including a retired state trooper who did not enjoy it. My mother glowed. My father laughed and told the room, "She gets that from her mother's side. Good thing it's not a job." Everyone laughed with him. I remember deciding somewhere between the parking lot and home that I would stop showing him the things I was good at. I would just be good at them. In 1997, the letter came. An Army ROTC scholarship to Penn State, full ride. And I laid it on the kitchen table next to the salt and pepper like it was nothing, because in our house, you did not make a production of yourself. My mother read it twice and put her hand over her mouth. My father read it once, set it down, and said, "The Army's a phase for a girl like you. You'll be home in 4 years." He never said I would fail. He was always careful that way. He just made it sound like succeeding wouldn't count. I took the scholarship. I took it the way you take a dare. 4 years later, in 2001, I stood on a parade field at Penn State and raised my right hand, and a sergeant major pinned the gold bars of a second lieutenant on my shoulders. My mother cried. My father shook my hand like I was a vendor he was meeting for the first time. I had wanted infantry, but in 2001, that door was closed to women, so I went armor, into the staff and support roles that were the only opening, and I decided I would pry that door wider from the inside. Tanks made sense to me, the way the lathe made sense to my father. Steel, angles, timing. I just never got the chance to tell him that in a way he could hear. In 2003, I deployed to Iraq as a first lieutenant, leading a scout platoon attached to an armor task force. That was where I met Monica Tran, another lieutenant, small and unimpressed and sharper than anyone in the room. We split a tin of instant coffee for 9 months, and we have never really been out of each other's lives since. It was also where I learned the thing about myself that would shape everything that came later. We were running route reconnaissance south of Baghdad, and the patterns of the ambushes started speaking to me. Not mystically, practically, where the culverts were, where the sightlines broke, where I would be if I were the one hunting us. I started briefing the task force on where contact would come, and I started being right. The intelligence officer called it luck for about 6 weeks, and then he started scheduling me into his planning sessions. Back home, the shop lost its biggest contract that same year, a parts supplier that moved its work overseas. My mother mentioned it on a crackling phone call, the worry buried under cheerfulness the way she buried everything. I started sending a third of my pay home every month. I did it through my mother, and we did not discuss it, and my father cashed the checks and never once mentioned them. Not a thank you, not an acknowledgement. The money kept the lights on for almost 2 years, and at Christmas he told his brother that the Army was keeping Renee busy playing soldier. I stood in the kitchen holding a casserole dish and said nothing. You learn a kind of patience in a family like mine. It is not weakness. It is load-bearing. I want to tell you about one morning because I have carried it for more than 20 years. It was near the end of that first deployment in 2004, and I was 25 years old, standing on a berm at dawn, waiting for a convoy to stage. The desert out there is not like the desert I live in now, but dawn is dawn. The light came up gray and gold, and I stood there reading the ground the way other people read a newspaper. This wadi, that rooftop, the dead space behind the canal berm, and I felt the whole landscape resolve into a chessboard. Every piece visible, every move ranked. I could see it. I had always been able to see it. And I remember thinking that there was no one back home who would ever ask me what that felt like. So I stopped expecting them to ask. I wrote letters home about the weather and the food. I told my mother the true things in fragments she could keep, and I made a quiet arrangement with myself, standing on that berm. I would not perform for anyone again, not my father, not the army, not the men who looked at a female armor officer like a typo. I would learn to win quietly, because nobody where I came from clapped for the kind of winning I did. And winning quietly, it turns out, is its own kind of weapon. The people who underestimate you hand you the first move, every single time, and they never even feel it leave their hands. When the deployment ended, Monica and I sat on our duffel bags on a flight line in Kuwait, and she asked me what I wanted out of all this. A command, I told her. Any command. She shook her head and said, "No. You want the other thing? You want to be the one nobody sees coming." I told her that wasn't a job. I was wrong. It was. It just took the Army another 2 decades to give it a name, and a desert, and a radio call sign that would one day make a full colonel go pale in a theater full of his own officers. The years between 2005 and 2014 went by the way Army years do. In 2-year bites, each one with its own zip code. I made captain in 2005. I took a company in 2007, an armor company, and deployed it back to Iraq for 15 months. I will not tell you that command was easy, because it wasn't, but it was the first time the whole weight of something rested on me. 130 soldiers and 14 tanks, and I found out the weight fit. My company came home with everyone we left with. There are officers with better medals than mine. There are not many with a cleaner ledger, and the ledger is the only arithmetic I have ever cared about. I made major in 2011 and spent 2 years as a plans officer, which sounds like furniture, and turned out to be a graduate school. And then, in 2014, the assignment officer called with what he clearly considered bad news. A tour as an observer coach trainer at the National Training Center, out in the Mojave Desert in California. Babysitting war games, he said, apologetically. I took it because the timing worked. I had no idea I was about to meet the rest of my life. If you have never seen the place, I do not have the words to make it real for you, and I have stood in it for years. 1,000 square miles of rock and creosote and ancient lake beds, mountains the color of rust, valleys that swallow entire battalions. Brigades come there to fight the hardest battle the Army can legally arrange, against a resident opposing force, a real regiment whose entire job is to play the enemy. My first month, I stood on a ridge and watched that opposing force take apart a visiting armor brigade in 11 days. They were outnumbered. It did not matter. They knew every fold of the ground, they moved like weather, and they punished every assumption the visitors brought with them. I watched a brigade commander, a proud man with a bright future, stand outside his destroyed command post with his hands on his hips, and I understood something with total clarity. The enemy is the best teacher the Army owns, and somebody gets to be the enemy. My father visited me exactly once in those years. 2018, when I was a lieutenant colonel commanding an armor battalion at Fort Bliss. My mother arranged it, the way she arranged everything. He walked my motor pool with his cap in his hand, and for 1 hour, watching my mechanics tear down a power pack, he was almost happy. Then at dinner, he asked me when I was going to get a real job with a pension I could explain to people. My battalion had just been named the best in the division. The plaque was in the living room where we were eating. My mother kept a scrapbook of every clipping, every photo, every order I was ever published in, and she kept it on the coffee table, and my father pretended for years that he had never opened it. Monica was a lieutenant colonel by then, too, and when I called her that night, she listened the way she has always listened, and then she said, "Renee, he's never going to hand it to you. Stop standing at his window. She was right. I knew she was right. Knowing is not the same as done, but it was a start. I made colonel in 2022. And in 2023, the Army did the one thing I had stopped letting myself want. It gave me the regiment, the opposing force at the National Training Center, the enemy itself, the unit I had watched dismantle that brigade 9 years before. Change of command was on a gravel parade ground with the Rust Mountains behind us, and when I took the colors, I felt the weight fit again, the way it had with my company, except this time the weight was a legend. My call sign came with the job. Hydra 6. The joke in the regiment is older than anyone serving in it. Cut off one column and 2 more come around your flanks. Kill the head and the body keeps eating. Let me tell you what we actually do, because my father was not the only one who got it wrong. We are not laser tag. We fight with real vehicles across real distance with an instrumented system that adjudicates every shot, and we fight to win, inside the rules, every single rotation. We study the visiting brigade's doctrine, we study their commanders' writings, and then we hunt them for 14 days, and every mistake they make against us in California is a mistake they will not make overseas, where mistakes come home under a flag. We are the enemy the Army pays to lose to, so that its sons and daughters never lose to a real one. I have heard our work called a game by people who should know better. The cemeteries we keep empty are not a game. In the summer of 2024, my father retired. 53 years of machining, and they threw him a party at the VFW, the same hall where I'd once beaten 4 grown men at chess. I flew home for it. I stood in a room full of people I'd known my whole life, while my father worked the crowd, and when he got to me, he put his hand on my shoulder and introduced me to his old foreman with these words. You remember Renee? She does computer war games for the Army. There was laughter, easy and harmless, the way the laughter at a thing like that always sounds to everyone except the person it lands on. I smiled. I refilled the punch. I drove to the airport that night instead of staying over, and Monica, who had become my deputy commander by then, picked me up in the desert at 1 a.m. and did not ask why I was early. In January of 2026, the next rotation dropped, and the name on it made Monica whistle through her teeth. Colonel Brett Sorensen, youngest brigade commander in his year group. 2 valorous awards, a chest full of the right schools, a man being talked about for a star the way some horses are talked about before they ever run. He was also, as it happened, a published author. He had written a piece in a professional journal calling training center opposing forces a scripted petting zoo, an obstacle dressed up as an enemy, a box to be checked by serious men on their way to serious wars. Monica read the article out loud in my office, with theatrical enjoyment. Then she dropped it on my desk and said, "He writes like a man who's never been hunted." I read it twice. I pinned it to the planning board myself. I was not angry. I want that understood, because everything that happened afterward depended on it. A man tells you exactly who he is on the page and over the radio, and in the way he treats people he believes are beneath him. Colonel Sorensen had handed me a complete study of his own assumptions, free of charge, weeks before he ever crossed into my desert. I looked at that article the way my father looked at a piece of raw stock, seeing the shape inside it. Then I told my staff to begin the commander's estimate, and I went home, and I slept very well. His brigade rolled in at the end of February, 2026, 4,000 soldiers and their machines draped across the railhead like the circus arriving. And for 2 days the cantonment area hummed with the choreography of reception and staging. On the second day, by a custom older than most of the soldiers on that post, the commander of the opposing force pays a call on the visiting brigade staff to deliver the terrain and threat overview. It is a courtesy and a warning in one folder. I had delivered it to 9 straight brigades. 9 colonels had shaken my hand and listened with varying degrees of attention while I told them what the desert was about to do to them. I had spent that morning on a range with my reconnaissance troop, so I arrived at the brigade's operations center in a faded field jacket over my duty uniform. The jacket I have worn for years because the high desert in February is colder than anyone believes. The jacket covered my rank and my name tape. I want to be honest with you. I did not plan that. I have replayed it enough times to be sure. I had a map case under one arm and my regiment's terrain folder under the other, and I stepped through the door of their planning tent as the staff was assembling around the map boards, 40 officers, coffee, the smell of new gear, and printer toner. Colonel Brett Sorensen looked up from the map table. I recognized him from the photograph beside his article. Tall, silver at the temples, the kind of handsome that has never once been told to wait its turn. He looked at me, at the old field jacket, at the map case, and a grin spread across his face, and he said, loudly enough for the whole tent, "Wrong room, ma'am. This is where the warfighters plan." The laughter rolled through that tent like weather. Not vicious. Casual. That was the part I noted with a kind of clinical interest, how casually it came. 40 officers laughing at a woman in an old jacket because the senior man in the room had given them permission. Sorensen turned to his executive officer and added, "Somebody walk her back to the welcome center before she gets lost." More laughter. Near the map boards, a major with an operations officer's haunted look, I would learn his name was Felix Grant, started to speak. "Sir, I think she might be." And Sorensen cut him off without even looking at him. "Briefing's at 10, Felix." I should tell you what was in that folder, because it is the detail that still astonishes the people who hear this story. The terrain and threat overview is not a formality. It is the distilled experience of every rotation my regiment has ever fought. The corridors, the choke points, the named areas where brigades die, and a candid summary of how my opposing force fights, our habits, our preferences, our favorite ground. 9 colonels before him had taken that folder like a man being handed a weather report for a hurricane. Some of them studied it. The ones who studied it lost more slowly and went home with fewer scars and better staffs. The folder was, in every sense that matters, the answer key. He laughed it out of the room without ever learning it existed. I have been asked, since, why I did not simply open the jacket, show the eagle on my chest, say my name, watch the tent recalibrate in real time. I have no noble answer. The truth is that standing in that doorway, I felt something settle in me, cold and smooth. The same thing I felt on the berm in Iraq in 2004. I was reading the ground. He had just shown me, in front of his entire staff, exactly how he processed surprise. He did not investigate it. He did not interrogate it. He laughed at it, assigned it a story that flattered him, and moved on without checking. A man who does that in a tent does it in a war. He did not insult me in that doorway. He handed me his reconnaissance. So I said nothing. I stepped back out into the cold, and I gave the terrain folder to a staff sergeant by the generators and asked him to see it delivered to the brigade operations section. Then I drove the 40 minutes back out into the training area, to my own headquarters, with its plywood walls and its maps of 1,000 square miles I knew like the inside of my own hands, and by the time I arrived, the story had outrun me, the way stories do. The staff sergeant had talked. My operations officer met me at the door with a face like a thunderhead, and behind him I could see my staff, the best enemies on the planet, all of them waiting to see what I would do about it. I told them the truth. We were going to run the rotation by the book. No vendettas, no theater, no special package for the colonel who laughed. The book was enough. I had been studying Brett Sorensen for 6 weeks, his article, his command philosophy, the after-action reviews from his last warfighter exercise, and the book said his brigade was fast, proud, and addicted to its own momentum, and that its commander believed reconnaissance was something that happened to other people. We did not need to be angry. We needed to be patient. Anger is loud, and patience is quiet, and I had spent 40 years learning which one wins. That night I signed the opposing force operations order for rotation 2604. 14 days of free play inside the rules of the exercise. I remember walking out to the gravel lot afterward. The cold came down off the Rust Mountains with the dark, and somewhere north of me, 4,000 soldiers were settling into their first night in my desert, and their commander was presumably enjoying his coffee, having already forgotten the woman in the field jacket. I stood there and felt the size of the ground between us. At dawn, the siren would sound and the war would start, and 2 forces would wake up in the same desert, and only one of them knew who the other was. The first reports came in a little after midnight on day 1, and they were almost disappointing in how faithful they were. Sorensen's cavalry squadron pushed its troops up the central corridor, exactly where his journal article said, "Reconnaissance ought to be bold," exactly on the timeline his last exercise suggested he favored. I stood at the map in my headquarters and annotated his habits like a scholar grading a familiar student. My intelligence officer grinned at me in the red light. I did not grin back. I have a rule about gloating before anything has actually happened, and besides, faithfulness to doctrine is not stupidity. It would take more than one night to know whether the man could adapt. That was the only question I cared about. Everything else was arithmetic. At 2 a.m, Monica found me on the steps of the operations center with coffee, the way she has been finding me with coffee since 2003. We sat in the cold and watched the heat shimmer off the generator exhaust, and she asked about the briefing tent, because of course she had heard, the whole regiment had heard. I told it to her straight, the grin, the line, the laughter, the door. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You've been getting laughed out of rooms your whole life. The rooms keep being wrong." And because it was 2 a.m, and because it was Monica, I told her the other story, the one I had never said out loud, about the VFW hall in 2024. My father's hand on my shoulder, computer war games. She listened all the way through. She did not offer me anything as cheap as sympathy. She just said, "Same room," and we drank our coffee, and the desert wind moved through the dark like something patrolling. I called home 2 nights later on a quiet shift. My mother wanted to know about the weather and whether I was eating, the eternal questions, and I gave her the eternal answers. Then in the background, I heard my father's voice rise up from in front of the television, not even directed at the phone, the way a man talks past a thing. "Ask her if the army ever lets her shoot anything real." My mother's silence had an apology folded inside it. I said gently that we shot quite a lot of things out here, and that I loved them both, and I ended the call and stood for a while looking at the map of the central corridor. You can love people who cannot see you. I had learned that years ago and tested it more times than I could count. You just stop handing them the telescope. You stop narrating the view. You let them have the version of you they can carry, and you go back to work in the country where your actual life happens. At dawn, I walked my line companies, the way I tried to every few days. I want you to understand who my soldiers are, because the army mostly doesn't. The opposing force does not get parades. My troopers spend their careers playing the villain in someone else's war story. Rotation after rotation, in vehicles dressed up to look like the other side's, and they take a professional pride in it that borders on religious. A 19-year-old private from a coal town, not so different from mine, asked me that morning, while we checked the camouflage on his vehicle, whether it ever bothered me that nobody knew our names. I told him the truth. Every mistake a brigade makes against us here is a funeral that never happens overseas. We are the inoculation. Nobody thanks the needle, and the needle does not need it. The private's question stayed with me through the morning, the way the good ones do. Nobody knows our names. It is true, and it is the design. When a brigade goes home from my desert, the stories they tell are about themselves, what they learned, what they survived, and that is exactly as it should be, because the lesson has to belong to them, or it will not hold. We are the anonymous half of every one of those stories. My troopers paint themselves into the scenery of other people's growth, rotation after rotation, and do it at a standard that would humble most line units, and the only audience that ever sees their best work is the audience being beaten by it. I have commanded soldiers in actual combat, and I will tell you without blinking that I have never led better ones than these. What I felt walking back was not anger at Brett Sorensen. It had already become something more useful, a focus with no temperature at all. Monica says that when I go quiet like that, it is the most frightening version of me, and she is allowed to say so because she has watched it work for 23 years. The decision I made in those first nights was simple, and I would stand by it in front of any review in the army. There would be nothing personal in this rotation, no trap built out of spite, no humiliation engineered for its own sake. He would get the same enemy the last 9 brigades got, the honest one, the one that fights by the book. It is just that the book, applied without mercy to a proud man's assumptions, is the most personal thing there is. He would do this to himself. My regiment would simply keep the appointment. On the 4th night, I signed the order for the first major engagement of the rotation, and I initialed the phase line my planners had drawn with a steady hand. Phase 1 had a shape my staff knew well, though we had never run it quite this way before. Let him win something small. Pride is an appetite. The fastest way to a proud man's throat is to feed him first and watch which way he leans when he is chewing. I put down the pen and looked at the red markers on the map, my regiment, my desert, my 40 years of being the person nobody saw coming. all of it arranged in neat columns in the dark. Then I went to bed and slept the sleep my father never believed my job could earn. We gave him the village on day 5. It sits at a crossroads in the central corridor, a cluster of cinder block buildings the training center built to be fought over, and his lead battalion came at it with a competence I noted honestly in my log. My forward company resisted for 90 minutes, made it look expensive, and then withdrew north in apparent disorder, leaving behind 2 disabled vehicles and the smell of victory. That night, the exercise control feed carried the sound of his staff celebrating. His tempo changed within 12 hours, exactly the way I had bet it would. Brigades are like people. Feed them a win, and they lean forward, and a brigade leaning forward shows you its throat. His reconnaissance started moving faster than its own security. His fuel planning started assuming tomorrow would look like yesterday, and his radio traffic acquired the swagger of men who believed the petting zoo was open. The Wadi came 2 days later. My withdrawing column let itself be found, let itself be chased, and pulled his cavalry troop 20 kilometers north into a drainage network my regiment has fought across for decades. There is a reverse slope up there with a sightline that does not exist on any map product because the microterrain swallows it, and my anti-armor company had lived on that slope for 2 days, cold, dispersed, silent. The umpires assessed his cavalry troop destroyed in 11 minutes. 11. I stood in my operations center and listened to the adjudication, net call it, vehicle by vehicle. And I felt nothing you could call joy. It was the feeling of a calculation resolving. The brigade was now blind in the north, and a brigade that cannot see does not stop moving. It moves by faith. Faith, in my desert, is a casualty producer. I want to explain the Wadi properly, because 11 minutes deserves its anatomy. An engagement like that is not luck, and it is not magic. It is 2 days of soldiers lying still on cold rock with their vehicles dispersed and shut down, eating cold rations, urinating into bottles, maintaining a silence so complete that the brigade's sensors swept across them twice and reported empty desert. It is a troop commander who rehearsed the trigger line until her gunners could shoot it asleep. It is the patience to let the first vehicles pass, and the discipline to wait for the body of the formation, and the cold arithmetic of opening the engagement at the moment when the enemy can neither push through nor back out. His cavalry came up that drainage at speed, chasing what they believed was a broken enemy, and the slope spoke once, and it was over. The umpires told me afterward that the troop's survivors sat in their vehicles for a long moment before anyone keyed a radio. 11 minutes, and the brigade's eyes were gone. Then we took his voice. My signal company is small and it is wicked, and inside the rules of the exercise, it began to degrade his command nets, jamming windows timed to his decision points, false traffic salted with just enough truth to cost him minutes. Minutes are the whole war out here. And on the 3rd night of it, my radio operators began signing off the opposing force command net the way they always do, with the call sign that came with my colors, Hydra 6. The intercepts told us his battalions had started to hear it, this calm female voice on the red net, closing transmissions like a door clicking shut. By day 9, the name had become a rumor inside his brigade, a story soldiers told at the fuel point. Some of his officers reportedly believed Hydra 6 was a psychological operation. In a way, I suppose I was. I learned later, from the after-action interviews and from Felix Grant himself, what those days looked like inside the brigade's operations center, and I will tell it plainly because Grant earned the telling. He stood at the map on day 8, with the cavalry gone and the nets failing, and said, "Sir, the OPFOR commander is shaping us. We're fighting the plan they want us to fight." He was the only one saying it. And Sorensen, who had now lost a troop, a corridor, and his voice, looked at the one officer telling him the truth and said, "The LP4 runs a script, Felix. Update the graphics." The next morning, Grant was moved to the night shift, where the brigade keeps its inconvenient people. He took his honesty with him and kept a log, every observation, every warning, time-stamped in a green notebook. Remember the notebook. It matters later. The voice was Monica's idea originally, years before this rotation, and I should give her the credit she will pretend not to want. Most opposing force nets are deliberately boring, procedural traffic in flat tones. She argued that the enemy should have a presence, something the visiting soldiers would remember at 2 a.m, and so I began closing the regiment's significant transmissions myself, calm, unhurried, signing off like a woman locking up a shop at the end of the day. It costs nothing. It is completely legal inside the exercise. And it works on the imagination of a tired brigade in ways no jamming package can touch. I want to pause here and say something about how it felt, because this is the part of the story where people expect savor, and I would be lying if I gave it to them. The laughter in that briefing tent did not cross my mind during those days. There was no room for it. Running a regiment in 14 days of free play is like conducting an orchestra in a sandstorm, and I slept in 90-minute pieces and ate standing up like everyone else. But late on day 9 at the map, my planners traced the brigade's projected axis north, the axis we had spent a week paying for, and it ran like a drawn wire into the valley my regiment calls the Kettle. Steep walls, 2 passes, dead ground deep enough to hide a battalion, and we had hidden one. My operations officer asked me the only question left. Would he really come? I looked at the wire on the map, and I thought about the grin in that tent and about every room I had ever been laughed out of, and I gave my staff the only intelligence estimate I was ever completely certain of. He'll come. Pride drives faster than doctrine. The withdrawal began on day 10, and it was the best theater my regiment has ever staged. A regiment-wide retrograde north, deliberate and ragged in exactly the right proportions, and the proportions are everything. Withdraw too cleanly, and a professional staff smells the choreography. Withdraw too sloppily, and they slow down to investigate the windfall. We rehearsed the raggedness. I had company commanders arguing on unencrypted nets about pickup times that did not exist. A traffic jam staged at a D-file and cleared just slowly enough to be seen clearing. A recovery vehicle left working frantically on a perfectly healthy tank. We abandoned fuel points with the pumps still warm. We let his electronic warfare teams find a planted overlay, a marked weakness in our line that any hungry commander would read as the seam to split. Grant, on the night shift, flagged it as bait in his green notebook, and his entry said so in 9 words. Nobody read the night shift log until the rotation was over. The brigade surged north on day 11 with everything it had left, and I stood at my map and watched 4,000 people accelerate into the shape of their commander's need to be right. And the only thing I said out loud that whole night was a request for more coffee. The Kettle closed before dawn on day 12. 2 of my battalions swung in behind his lead elements like jaws coming together, and the reserve I had kept invisible in dead ground for 3 days, cold meals, no radios, 3 days of discipline you cannot fake, came up out of the earth and took both passes. I listened to the umpire net light up in the dark of my operations center, adjudication after adjudication, his combat power bleeding out in calm procedural voices. At 6:41 in the morning, the exercise control net assessed the brigade main command post, destroyed. The room around me did not cheer. My soldiers are professionals, and besides, there were 3 days left, and they knew I would use them. I stood there in the red light with 23 years of quiet winning in my chest, and the only ceremony I allowed myself was a long breath out. My command sergeant major found me at the map an hour after the command post call, and he stood beside me for a while in the way of sergeants major, saying nothing at considerable volume. Then he asked whether I wanted the regiment to ease off the pursuit, let the rotation glide to its scheduled end. I understood the kindness inside the question. I also understood what my answer would teach 400 troopers about who we are. We pursued, by the book, inside the rules, at the standard, until the exercise control net itself called the phase complete. The desert does not grade on a curve, and neither do the places these brigades deploy to afterward. Mercy at the wrong altitude is just a lie with good manners. There is a piece of footage from the exercise control cameras that I have watched exactly once. It shows Colonel Brett Sorensen standing outside his command post in the wind on the morning of day 12, hands on his hips, smoke canisters still hazing the air behind him, looking out at the valley walls. He stands there for a long time. Then he walks to the nearest umpire vehicle and asks a question, on the record, that the umpire later swore he asked with genuine bewilderment, no anger in it at all. "Who commands the Red Force?" And the umpire, following the protocol I had not requested, but did not mind, said, "You'll meet the commander at the AAR, sir." We ran the last 3 days at full standard. I want that noted because it would have been easy to coast. The scorecard was already historic, and some of my own officers suggested gently that the brigade had absorbed the lesson. I declined. They paid for 14 days of enemy, and they would get 14 because the lesson is not humiliation, the lesson is the standard, and a standard with a mercy switch is not a standard. But I will also tell you what we did on day 13 when a heat snap came through, freakish for February, and one of his rifle companies got stranded on the far side of the southern corridor with a broken water trailer. My operations officer brought me the situation, and I authorized water resupply through the umpires within the hour. War games have rules, and the desert has rules, and the desert's rules outrank everyone. The company's first sergeant sent back a message through the umpire net, 2 words, "Thank you." It was, at that point, the politest thing anyone in that brigade had said to me. The end of exercise siren went on the morning of day 14, and the desert exhaled. I drove out alone that afternoon to the ridge above the kettle, the way I do at the end of every rotation, and I stood on the rocks and watched the recovery operation crawl through the valley below, wreckers and lowboys dragging the brigade's pride out of the sand. The scorecard, when exercise control finalized it, was the worst any brigade had posted in 6 years. The number is not the point. The number was never the point. Somewhere down in that valley was a man who had been told 14 days earlier exactly what the desert was going to do to him, in a folder delivered by a woman he laughed out of a tent. He had laughed, the desert hadn't. And in 2 days at the after-action review, the rotation's last appointment would be kept. The one I had been keeping my whole life, in one room after another, with one earl after another. For the first time in my career, I let myself look forward to it. The after-action review for rotation 2604 convened in the post theater at 9 in the morning. The whole brigade leadership in the seats, battalion commanders, staff, the observer coach teams who had lived beside them for 2 weeks, maybe 300 people under the old proscenium arch where 60 years of war stories have been taken apart. I waited in the wings, stage left, in my army green service uniform, eagles on the shoulder straps, 25 years of ribbons in their tidy rows. Through the curtain gap, I could see Sorensen in the front row, freshly shaved, sitting the way men sit when they have rehearsed composure. Major General Curtis Boyd, the commanding general of the training center, a sandblasted man who had run more rotations than anyone alive, opened the review without notes, and I would not change a word of what he said. 14 days ago, I told Colonel Sorensen the enemy here would be the best he ever fought, Boyd said. I'd like to introduce the commander of that enemy. I crossed the stage. The theater came to attention with that rolling thunder a few hundred people make standing at once. And I let the room hold still for a moment, and I looked down at the front row, at the man who had last seen me in a doorway in a faded field jacket. I watched it land. I have seen surprise take a lot of men a lot of ways. Colonel Brett Sorensen did not flinch and did not flush. He went very still, the stillness of a man feeling 14 days reorganize themselves in his memory at machine speed. The doorway, the laughter, the folder he never read, the voice on the net. I gave him the smallest of nods, and into the silence I said, Hydra 6, good to see you again, Colonel. And 300 people turned in their seats to look at him. I had thought in the wings about what I would say in that first moment, and I had discarded a dozen versions for being too sharp or too soft. The line I used was the only one that was simply true. We had met. He had seen me. The rest of the rotation had been our correspondence. Standing at the podium, I watched the brigade's officers do the same arithmetic their commander was doing, the ones who had laughed working out that they had laughed, the ones near the door that day suddenly grateful for where they had been standing. I did not hold the pause 1 second longer than the introduction required. Power you do not use weighs more than power you do. Then we went to work, because the review is the cathedral, and I do not deface cathedrals. For 4 hours, I walked that brigade through its own decisions, and I did it the way I would want it done to me. I named what was good, and meant it. 2 of his companies fought superbly in the kettle, and I said so with the specifics that make praise worth anything. I named what failed, and why, decision by decision, the gift village, the wadi, the leaning tempo, the seam we sold them. I never mentioned the briefing tent. I did not need to. Everyone in that theater had heard the story by the second day of the rotation, and the story sat in the room like an unexploded round the entire morning. And the discipline of not touching it was the loudest thing I have ever not said. He came to find me afterward at the terrain board, alone, and we stood over the miniature desert for 3 more hours while he asked his questions. They were good questions, and I answered every one of them completely, which surprised him until he understood it. There are no trade secrets in my regiment. We will show any commander in the army exactly how we beat him, every trigger, every seam, every minute of patience, because the showing is the product. The brigades that take the answer key home and study it come back years later as colonels and generals who are harder to kill, and that is the only legacy my regiment has ever wanted. That is the thing I want recorded about Brett Sorensen, that when it finally broke open, what came out was a soldier. He asked where the reserve had hidden and how long it had sat there. He asked when I had decided on the kettle, and then he stopped moving the little markers and asked the real one. You knew at the briefing what you were going to do to me. It was not quite a question. I gave it back to him straight, because he had earned straight. No, I knew what you were going to do to yourself. My regiment just kept the appointment. The next morning, before his brigade began the long rail load home, he assembled his entire staff in the motor pool, and he said this, in the open, with the wind flapping the canvas, and Felix Grant standing in the second row. On day 2, I laughed a colonel out of our planning room because I saw a field jacket and decided I knew what was under it. Then I spent 2 weeks losing to her. If you take one thing home, take that. He reinstated Grant to the day shift on the spot, read 2 entries from the green notebook aloud, and credited them by name and date. An apology that cost nothing changes nothing. This one was public, specific, and expensive, and I have kept the memory of it the way I keep very few things. We shook hands on the theater steps before his convoy rolled. It was not friendship, not yet. It was the other thing, the rarer thing, respect with a spine in it. I stood in the cold and watched 4,000 soldiers leave my desert better than they came, which is the entire job. And then I went back to my plywood headquarters, and Monica looked up from her desk and asked how it felt. I told her the truth. It felt like the room had finally been right. The rotation's echo took about 2 weeks to reach me. It arrived as a letter, handwritten, on plain paper, postmarked from his home station, and I knew the hand before I read the signature because men like Sorensen write the way they march. The letter was professional and precise, and it did not grovel, which is why it mattered. He wrote that he had ordered his staff to study my regiment's tactics for their upcoming deployment. He wrote that the seam we sold him had taught him more than 2 of his schools, and at the bottom, beneath the signature, he had added a single line. Tell your radio operators the voice was the worst part. I laughed out loud, alone in my office. And then I filed the letter in the bottom drawer of my desk, the drawer with 20 years of things I never showed anyone. And my mother is the only other person alive who knows that drawer exists. In March, the selection list came out, and Felix Grant was picked below the zone for battalion executive officer, a year ahead of his peers. He wrote to me, too. He said the after-action review had made his green notebook famous, and that famous notebooks get their authors promoted, and that he had started teaching his lieutenants to keep logs nobody reads because someday somebody does. I wrote back one line. The Army runs on people who tell the truth on the night shift. I have his letter in the same drawer. Spring is the between season at the training center, one brigade's dust settled and the next one's advance party, not yet on the ground, and I use the quiet the way I always do. Riding the ground with my company commanders, rewriting the threat models, walking the kettle on foot with my planners to argue about whether the passes could be held by a smaller force. People imagine that an opposing force coasts between rotations. The truth is the opposite. Our whole value is that we are better every time a brigade arrives than we were when the last one left, because the enemy overseas is not standing still either, and we are the rehearsal for him. I signed 3 changes to our tactics that spring that came directly out of what Sorensen's 2 good companies had done to us in the valley. The whetstone gets sharpened too. Nobody ever thinks about that part. And then it was April, and my mother called on a Sunday, and partway through the eternal questions, her voice changed gears, and I knew something was coming before she said it. There had been a documentary on one of the cable channels, she said, about the National Training Center, about the desert, the rotations, the opposing force. Your father watched it, she said. He watched the whole thing and he didn't say a word, and he's been quiet ever since. And Renee, he wants to come to the visitors' day. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and the evening coming down, purple over the Rust Mountains, and I am not going to pretend my first feeling was joy. My first feeling was the bracing. 40 years of it, the instinct that hope around Earl Lockhart is the thing you pay for later. I was quiet long enough that she said my name. And then I said yes. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it, which Monica informs me is the only way I have ever said yes to anything that wasn't a mission. The Visitors' Day was already on the calendar for May, one of those community open houses the post runs, static displays, a live maneuver demonstration, families and school buses, and local press. My regiment rehearsed its piece with the seriousness we bring to everything, which the soldiers find funny, and I do not, and I assigned myself no speaking role on the program. I told myself it was humility. Boyd saw the draft program, crossed my name into the narrator slot with his own pen, and sent it back with a note in the margin. They should hear the voice. It's the worst part. Generals read other people's mail. It is one of their privileges. Monica asked me the week before what I wanted out of the day. It was the flight line question from Kuwait a quarter century later, and she knew it, which is why she asked it. I told her I had stopped wanting. I told her I had made my peace years ago, that whatever my father could give now would be late and small, and that I had built a life that did not require it. All of which was true, none of which explained why I had my uniform pressed twice. The week before they arrived, I caught myself doing something I had not done in decades. I drove the demonstration route alone on a Sunday and looked at my desert the way a stranger would, the way he would, trying to guess what an old machinist's eye would land on. The scale of it. The machines. The young soldiers with their sleeves rolled. I gave it up after an hour because you cannot stage manage a man's heart, and because Monica's voice was in my head, telling me to stop standing at his window. Whatever he saw, he would see. I had spent 40 years learning that lesson one way. I was apparently going to spend one more weekend learning it again. He came on a Saturday morning in May. I was in the operations building when the gate camera feed cycled onto the visitor center lot, and there it was. The dusty Ford pickup with the Pennsylvania plates and the toolbox welded into the bed. 11 years old and maintained like a rifle. I watched my father climb out of it on the monitor, smaller than my memory kept insisting. And he stood in the desert sunlight, holding his cap in both hands, and he looked up at the ridgeline for a long time, the way men look at the ocean. My mother came around the truck and took his arm. 40 years I had waited for him to come see. I had stopped waiting. He came anyway. I watched the feed for one more second, and then I went down to meet them. The demonstration began at 11 on the bleachers facing the maneuver corridor, with maybe 2,000 visitors shading their eyes. My regiment put a battalion in the box, armor on line coming out of the haze with their dust plumes towering behind them like a moving weather front. The narration net patched through the loudspeakers so the crowd could hear the choreography, and every commander on that net acknowledging the same 2 words at the end of each order. Hydra 6. I stood at the narrator's podium and talked to 2,000 civilians through what they were watching, and I watched only one of them. He stood at the bleacher rail, my mother beside him, and a young trooper from my headquarters company stood nearby answering visitor questions, and I learned afterward what that trooper, who had no idea who the old man was, told my father when he asked who commanded all this. "Her regiment's the best enemy on earth, sir. She makes everybody better." My mother said Earl didn't say anything back. He just held the rail. Afterward came the static displays, and that is where my father came back to life, because static displays are made of machinery, and machinery is his country. We walked the line of vehicles together, the 3 of us, and he ran his hand along a track block the way he used to check a finished part coming off the lathe. Fingertips first, then the flat of the hand, listening through his skin. He asked the crews questions, real ones, about track tension and final drives and what fails first in the heat. Machinists' questions, and the soldiers answered him with the courtesy young troopers reserve for old men who clearly know what metal is. I stood back and let him have it. Whatever was happening in him, it had been 40 years coming, and you do not crowd a thing like that. It was at the end of the row, beside the last vehicle, that he finally said it. He kept his hand flat on the armor, and he looked down the line of machines, not at me, because looking at me would have been more than the words could carry, and he said, "All those years I thought you played at war. You've been the whetstone." And then, while I was still absorbing that, he turned and looked at me directly, which Earl Lockhart does not do, and his voice came out flat, the way it does when he is holding it level on purpose. And he said, "I was wrong, Renee. 3 words, 50 years of metal shavings and 1 chess night and a kitchen table in 1997. And he laid the words down between us like a finished part, deburred, measured, done. I said, I know, Dad, which in our family is what forgiveness sounds like. Then my mother opened her tote bag and handed him the scrapbook, the one from the coffee table, and he held it out to me. It was full, not just her clippings, the ones I knew about. There were new pages, careless of glue, articles about the training center cut from magazines, a printout of Sorensen's professional journal, the program from a change of command he had not attended. He had been adding to it in secret since the retirement party, since computer war games, almost 2 years of clippings nobody made him cut. My mother had caught him at the kitchen table with the scissors months ago and never said a word to either of us. She is the quietest person in this story, and she always knew the most. I keep the scrapbook in my quarters now. My mother insisted, and for once my father backed her, gruffly, saying the shop was no place for paper. I have turned its pages more times than I will admit. The early ones are all her, neat corners, dated captions in cafeteria manager handwriting. The late ones are all him, crooked, overglued, a machinist working in an unfamiliar material. Somewhere in the middle of that book, without either of them ever saying a word to me, my parents had been keeping me all along. We had dinner that night at the dining facility because my father refused anything fancier, and he asked questions through the whole meal. How the umpire instrumentation works, what the vehicles weigh, why the desert. Monica joined us for coffee and watched me answer him and grinned at me across the table like a woman collecting on a very old bet. There were no speeches, there was no cinematic embrace in golden light. There was an old machinist asking his daughter how things fit together and why, which is the only language he has ever had, and his daughter answering in it. Fluently, because it turns out it was always my language too. The fit, the tolerances, the work checked and true. We were never as different as the kitchen table made us feel. He just took 40 years to read the drawing. In late summer, word came through channels that Sorensen's brigade, deployed overseas by then, had executed a defensive operation under pressure, and the assessment credited their preparation, the seams they refused to show, the reconnaissance they refused to trust, the tempo they refused to let an enemy set. Lessons from the desert, the report said. I read it twice in my office with the evening sun coming through the blinds, and I thought about funerals that never happen, the empty arithmetic that is the whole job, the inoculation working in an arm somewhere far away. Then I closed the laptop. There is no trophy for the needle. There was never supposed to be. These days I still drive up to the ridge above the kettle when a new rotation comes in. I went last week. Dawn comes up gray and gold over the Rust Mountains, the same dawn from the berm in Iraq half a lifetime ago, and down in the valley a new brigade's column was rolling into the box. Headlights in the half-dark, 4,000 strangers full of confidence and doctrine, and somewhere among them, statistically certain, a man who will look at someone in a faded jacket and decide he knows what's under it. The desert and I will be ready, patient and impartial, the enemy who wants them to live. I stood on the rocks with my coffee and watched them come, and I will leave you with the only wisdom 47 years have actually left me holding. Somewhere out there is a room that will laugh when you walk in. Walk in anyway. Rooms learn. That's my story. The colonel who laughed at a woman in a faded field jacket spent 2 weeks learning what was under it, and to his credit, he carried the lesson better than most. I think about that briefing tent sometimes and about my father's kitchen table, and how the 2 rooms were really the same room all along. So let me ask you, has someone ever written you off at a glance, and how long did it take for them to find out what they missed? Did they ever own it the way Colonel Sorensen did, publicly and specifically? And if you've waited years, like I did with my dad, for 3 small words that finally came, I want to hear about that too. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story hit home, hit that like button and subscribe because it helps these stories find the people who need them. Until then, remember what the desert taught me. Somewhere out there is a room that will laugh when you walk in. Walk in anyway. Rooms learn.